Don't become a book editor. At least, not until you've heard the 5 things that I wish I'd known before becoming a book editor. Hey everyone, welcome to Forward Writing, where we talk about how to move your writing forward. Except today, we're talking all about book editing. My name is Jonathan Jordan. I'm an award winning ghostwriter, book coach, and developmental editor for books. And if you're like me, you're probably stepping into editing your first book without a super clear picture of what that word even means. I find that most people, when they hear the word editing, especially in the context of books, they're thinking of proofreading. They're thinking of fixing typos, fixing grammar, which is one of the last phases in the process of publishing a book. Now, proofreading is an amazing job to have. They really are superheroes in the industry, and they save all of us authors from looking really, really stupid when it's time to publish our books. But editing is so much bigger than that. And so that's why today I want to share with you the 5 things that I wish I had known about book editing so that when you step into the role as a book editor, you have a little bit more of a head start and hopefully you don't have to go through some of the same pains that I went through. So, with no more ado, let's get started. Number one, the first thing I wish I'd known about book editing before I became an editor is that I wish I'd known you don't have to do it all. So, on my first several projects, I thought that when you were a book editor, that meant you had to do every single phase of editing. And honestly, I didn't even know that there were different phases of editing until I started doing it for myself. So, in my book, Start with Story, I actually have a diagram in here that walks people through the full spectrum of editing and what each one of those layers of editing looks like. And so, at the highest, most creative levels of editing, you've got the developmental edit. Then underneath that, you've got a structural edit. Underneath that, you've got the line edit. And then you keep going down to copy editing, where it gets more detailed and more technical. And then all the way down again to proofreading, which happens at the very, very end. So there's all these different layers. And I thought when I became a book editor that I was responsible for all of those. And it was absolutely exhausting. And also, I wasn't as good at some of the levels of editing as I was at others. In fact, I found out that where I excelled the most was with developmental editing and structural editing at the highest, most creative levels, where we're looking at the big picture issues, where we're finding the gaps in the narrative, where we are helping the author really kind of come up with ideas that might be missing or helping them over different roadblocks, helping them find their blind spots. That was what I excelled at the most. The part that I wasn't so very good at were the copy editing, the proofreading. Frankly, those pieces just kind of bored me, and I wasn't very good at figuring all of those pieces out. Now, I still did them on occasion because when you're first building your business, you need to try a little bit of everything because you don't know what you might like in the beginning. But what you don't want to do is put the pressure on yourself that you need to do all of those levels of editing. In your first few projects, try out different things, figure out which ones you like, which ones you're best at, and then once you've zeroed in on that, then you can build a steadier business because you can position yourself as a developmental editor or as a copy editor. And you'll find that it's a lot easier for you to get jobs if you are more focused on one area of editing versus trying to do all of them yourself or trying to say you can do all of them. I've definitely had more success when people can think of me as just a developmental editor. And then if someone comes along and they're looking for copy editing or they're looking for proofreading, since that isn't something that I love doing and I'm not that great at doing, I get to refer those people to copy editors and proofreaders who I do know and who would do a much, much better job. Number two, nonfiction is an easier way to build your business than fiction. Now, if you're like me, I love fiction. I grew up loving reading. I still love reading. And in a lot of ways, fiction is my heartbeat. And I just love it so much. But what I discovered early on when I was trying to get clients is that it was very difficult to find fiction authors who were willing to work with an editor, especially a new editor like myself. It was a little bit easier for me to find people who were working on nonfiction because it's such a broad genre and there's a lot of different subgenres within nonfiction. So it was just an easier way for me to start building my portfolio because I knew people who were working on nonfiction, and it's a bit more of a lower hanging fruit than fiction tends to be. Also, as you're building your business, something I discovered is that nonfiction authors were also willing to pay me more than many of the fiction authors that were out there. And I'm not saying this to diss fiction authors. I am one myself, and I understand how difficult it can be when you're a fiction author and you see how expensive editing is. And until you're a book editor, it can really not make sense why we charge what we do. For instance, I remember seeing in a group I'm a part of on social media, someone was complaining that they got a quote from an editor and it was far above what they were expecting. In fact, they said in the post, I thought it would only cost about $200 for my book to be edited. And the book they were talking about was a 120,000 word fantasy. The real fantasy was that they thought it could be done for only $200. And again, a lot of this goes back to the misunderstanding about what editing means. So many fiction authors, they don't know all those different layers of editing, and they think, you know what? I've been editing my own book through this whole process. It's really clean. And so all I need is for someone to come behind me and just do a quick read through and just make sure there's no stray errors. But that's not what we really mean when we say, hey, you should go out and get a book editor for your manuscript. So yeah, it can be really disconcerting when you look at the pricing and you're wondering why it costs 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, even more than that. Whereas nonfiction authors that I've worked with have really not been very surprised when the pricing was that higher point. And they're ready and they're willing to pay it because they recognize that it's a skill that they're lacking. And they also recognize that they want their book to be the best it can be. So they have a willingness to invest in doing the process correctly to make sure that they're going to get the ROI on the book. And for nonfiction authors, the ROI, it's usually not book sales. It's usually something else that the book is going to open up for them, speaking opportunities, or they're using it as a lead magnet for their business to attract high-end clients, or they're using it to set themselves up as an expert in their field. So for them, the value isn't, hey, I'm going to sell 1 million copies of this. It's, I'm going to open up so many opportunities with this book, so I need to make sure that it is professional quality. So yeah, so that's the second thing I wish I had known, is that nonfiction is an easier way to build the business than fiction. Now, number three, your contract should eliminate scope creep. So let's talk about what scope creep is for a second. Scope creep is what happens when a client starts asking you to do additional steps in your editorial process that are not outlined in your contract. And so what happens for a lot of new business owners who are book editors is they don't have a detailed or tight enough contract. They just have a one-page good faith type agreement that says, I'm going to edit your book, but they don't spell out what type of editing they're going to be focusing on. They don't spell out how many revision processes there are going to be. And so one of my ghostwriting and editing friends, She went through my course several years ago, and something she told me was how she fell into this problem and she did not have a tight enough contract. So when her client kept coming back to her and saying, "Hey, are you also going to do this? Are you also going to do the copy edit?" She realized, oh, well, I never said in my contract what I do and don't do. So yeah, I guess I have to do the copy edit as well. Or she also had a client who came to her and said, "Hey, I want you to do another pass. I'm not quite ready to put the book out yet. Can you go ahead and do another top to bottom read through of the book?" Which added a lot of hours onto her plate. And again, her contract did not specify how many revision passes were allowed. And so my contract actually says specifically that you're allowed two revision passes. And beyond that, we will have to have a conversation about adding on an addendum, which will cost more. So you want to make sure that your contract is really tight and really specific about the type of service that you are providing, for how long, and how many revision passes. You want to make sure it has really firm boundaries. Otherwise, you're going to keep opening yourself up to scope creep time and time again, which is just lost time and lost money for you. Because think about it, the longer you work on that project, the longer it is before you get to take on a new project. So in the end, you're the one who ends up getting hurt the most. All right, the fourth thing that I wish I had known before I became a book editor is that charging an hourly rate is a death trap. Now, this one does need a little bit of nuance, because if you get a contract with a publisher, some publishers still set up their contracts based on an hourly rate. And so that's something where every now and then you do kind of have to compromise on that, because that's how they pay. And so you just need to ask questions about what you should be counting as hours and what you should not be counting as hours. But usually, if you do the math, you'll see that an hourly rate does not add up in your favor. So new book editors often are only thinking about the time it takes to do the actual editing on the book when they quote a price. And so they think to themselves, well, I want to make $50 an hour. It's probably going to take me 40 hours to do this job. So I'm going to quote $2,000. But what they're not thinking about is all the other time that goes into editing. So they're not thinking about all the back and forth emails to the client. They're not thinking about the admin work that they have to do, software that they might have to buy to help them be able to handle that specific job, research that they might have to do. So research is something that almost every level of editing needs to think about. So if you're a developmental editor, a lot of times I'm finding I need to do research because an author will make a claim in the text, and I need to see if that claim actually checks out and actually supports their point. So I'm going over to Google and I'm spending time doing some deep research. And every now and then I've had situations where I had to tell the author, hey, you can't really use this example because you got this fact wrong. It's not backed up by a credible source. This quote was misquoted. And, sometimes that's because they were doing research in ChatGPT or Claude. And sometimes the research that comes through those platforms is wrong. So you have to double check it. Or same thing if you're a copy editor, you're double checking those sources that an author has in there and you're making sure that they're formatted correctly. And in that process, sometimes you find out that the information is not quite correct. So, yeah, when you think about the full scope of time that you are putting into a manuscript, it's not just the reading, it's not just leaving notes, it's all of those admin tasks that you have to do. And I find most new editors, they are grossly underestimating the amount of time that it will take them to work on a manuscript. So generally, I tell people to shy away from hourly, because it's not only is it more likely be inaccurate, it's also very difficult to keep track of. It's one thing if you have a life where you don't have many distractions, but for myself as a parent to kids, I have distractions all the time. Sometimes my kid needs something from me and I have to stop what I'm doing and then I have to go do that. I'm not going to be able to click start and stop on a time counter every single time. So I have to estimate the amount of time that I spend on a project. And so I find that's the problem too, is it's hard to be ethical about it. It's hard to be honest about how much time you're actually spending on the project. So instead, I tend to suggest people look at the scope. They look at the whole project and they think about what that project is going to cost in terms of their total time investment in it. Now, you can certainly take that total and then break it down hourly for someone if you feel like that's easier for them to understand when you do the quote. And I understand going about it that way because hourly rates can be easier for some clients to understand. But on your end of how you do pricing, you shouldn't be thinking about it as an hourly rate. You are a business owner now. You should not be thinking in terms of how much you make on the clock per hour. You have evolved past that. You need to start thinking about yourself more as an entrepreneur, and you need to really be taking your business seriously. And it's hard to do that if you're still thinking only in terms of an hourly rate. So ditch the hourly rate as much as you can. Think about the project total and whether it accurately reflects how much you want to earn for the time that you're going to be investing in the project. All right, and finally, the last thing that I wish I had known before I became a book editor is I wish I had known that I'm not always going to be right. Yes, shocker, right? But you, as a book editor, you're not 100% of the time going to be right in the feedback that you give to a client. And so you have to keep an open mind and you have to be receptive to when they push back and understand what they are trying to accomplish. So something that I do at the beginning of every editing project is I don't like to get started on the editing until I've actually met with the author. Now, that's not difficult to do if it's someone who finds me and reaches out independently to talk to me. But if it's a project being assigned to me from a publisher, that's the first thing I insist on is I need to be able to meet and talk to the client so I can find out exactly what their goals are, so I can hear their voice, so I can understand who their audience is. About a year ago, I turned down one project because the publisher kept refusing in our back and forth emails. They kept making up excuses for why I couldn't talk with the authors and they were wanting me to start the project in a matter of days. And even though the money honestly would have been nice at the time because I was in a little bit of a dry spell, I ultimately turned it down and said no because I knew there was no way I could do a great job on that project if I did not talk to the authors directly. So that's something that I insist on. And what I found in my meetings with authors when I learn more about their audience and their goals for the book, I'm always so thankful that I do that because I realize that if I had gone into the manuscript with my own idea of what they wanted to accomplish, I would have left a lot of notes that would not have been helpful to them and would have contradicted what they were trying to accomplish with their book. And then on the flip side of it, a lot of times I give suggestions to authors and sometimes they respond back to a suggestion. They push back and they say, here's why I don't want to remove that paragraph. Here's why it's important for me to word it this way. And a lot of times in that dialogue, we discover, okay, you author are not 100% right. I'm not 100% right, but there's somewhere in the middle where we actually need to be. And through that dialogue, a lot of times we find some third option that is better than either of our original ideas. Or sometimes I hear their argument for why they need to keep a certain line in, or a paragraph, or a certain example in. And I realize, yep, you know what? They're right. We just need to leave it alone. Now I understand why they wanted it to say it this way. Or sometimes it changes my feedback and I say, okay, great. If that's what you're going to accomplish, then you need to add this. or you need to tweak this so it's more clear what you want to accomplish. Because right now it sounds like you're trying to do X, Y, and Z. And so sometimes authors just need to hear that perspective from you and for you to admit, yeah, my note was wrong, but my note was wrong because I didn't understand the intent. You need to be more clear about your intent, author. And again, that's part of the process and that's part of the benefit that you provide them as an editor is you're helping them see where even their great points aren't landing because they haven't been clear enough in the writing. So yeah, you need to understand you are not going to always be correct when you leave a note. There are going to be times the author is right. There are times that you need to put your ego to the side and realize you are not the end all be all. You do not need to be right 100% of the time. And if you are right 100% of the time, then someone's probably not being honest with you. You're probably not even being honest with yourself. There's always room to grow. There's always room to learn more as an editor. And you need to keep an attitude of humility when you approach a manuscript. And by the way, that includes making sure you leave positive notes for your client too. I am truly horrified sometimes when I see authors post online about some of the notes and feedback that they get from editors who are literally berating their writing. You can always be kind. You can always find a positive way to reframe your feedback and say, hey, this isn't working, but let's talk about how we can make it work. And so I always try to even leave notes for my authors where I'll say, wow, this is such a great point. Or I'll even leave friendly notes in there that say something like, LOL, I've had this exact thought before, because I want them to understand I'm not just trying to pick apart their baby and say everything that's wrong with it. I also want to acknowledge the pieces of it that are working well and that are doing well, and where I find the material relatable and where they're doing a good job of expressing their voice and their story. So you've got to make sure that you're leaving that positive feedback in there too. Otherwise, they're just going to feel like you are, frankly, just kind of shitting all over their work. And that's not super helpful for anyone. And you're not going to be able to get very good reviews if you're constantly just dumping on somebody's work. Sorry for the swear, but it's true. Like, you cannot be mean. It's not helpful. And you're going to end up hurting yourself way more than anything else. You're not proving anything about your abilities by berating an author for where they need to improve. So you can be right about something, your note could be right, but you can deliver it in a wrong way. And so yeah, that's something I wish I'd known when I came into book editing, is this idea that, hey, I'm not always going to be right and I need to make sure I'm listening to the author so that I can improve my feedback and improve my own skills in how I'm helping authors. Anyway, for those of you who are exploring becoming a full-time editor or a full-time ghostwriter, if you've started doing that on the side, but you're not quite sure how to build that up into a full-time business, I created a resource that helps you learn the exact steps to building a writing business that can actually scale. It's my course, Word Up. I'll include the link to it in the comments here, but it walks you through 28 lessons that show you how to build your business, how to become a six-figure writerpreneur, and in a lot faster time than what I did, because it took me about 10 years of freelancing before I was able to go from writing crappy $50 blogs to building a six-figure income stream. And so I show you in the course how to do that with practical steps. And each lesson only takes, some of them only take 10 minutes to do. At the most of them only take an hour at the most. So my idea in that is that even though it will take you some time and consistency to build up your pipelines and to create a successful business, at least now you don't have to do all the guesswork like I had to do, and you can scale a lot faster. So if that's you, if you're looking into becoming a book editor and you want to figure out how to make that your main job, I created Word Up specifically for you so that it can go a lot faster. But thank you so much for hanging out with me here today. For those of you who are editors, I'd love to hear from you. Which of these 5 were lessons that you also wish you had known before you became an editor? What would you like to add to the list? And what would you share with editors who are just starting out? So if you haven't already, make sure you are subscribed to my channel, as I'll continue to share weird writing tips, behind the scenes look at publishing, and book marketing tips to help you move your writing forward. See you later, storytellers.